Now, if I were to use the phrase or just the word etiquette, it probably doesn't sound particularly exciting to most people hearing that. When you think about etiquette, you probably think about, stuffy people in, maybe the 19th century who had all these very particular rules about how and where you should place your forks in a very kind of legalistic sense as a way maybe to judge people who were of other classes for not knowing the particularities of what the upper classes did with their silverware. Now, I want to say that the idea of etiquette and manners as well are things that go far beyond just kind of showing off your class or what you know or don't know. And I want to make an argument that the loss of etiquette and social rules in a clear sense in our society has been very negative, and that a unified society should have rules of what is proper, what is a right way to behave. So this is a very brief defense of etiquette. Now, maybe we should start by just talking about a distinction between etiquette and manners. Now, different authors on etiquette have distinguished these things a little bit differently, but generally etiquette refers to the social rules or the external things that one should follow. Manners are something more internal, so something more akin to virtue, something more akin to the character. So etiquette are the external rules that one follows, and then manners is the character or the behavior that flows out from who someone is in social settings and how you treat others and behave toward others. So why is it that people don't really talk about etiquette anymore? Because if you look back into the 19th century and then into the beginnings of the 20th century, etiquette was pretty standard. It was part of a standard education, especially depending upon social classes. But I don't think it's true that only the upper classes had an understanding of etiquette. But these things tended to disappear from our discourse, and people aren't really trained in etiquette anymore, unless you're part of maybe certain communities or certain areas of the world or the country. I know that, I'm speaking from an American context myself, and sure, in the northeastern United States where I live, perhaps there is some kind of remnant of what was in those areas, which probably is not the case in most parts of the country. And really, to be honest, it's not that much the case here unless you're in certain groups. So if we're talking about the loss then of etiquette, saying why did these things start to disappear? Well, there are a lot of moves and shifts that happen culturally that I've spoken about in plenty of places, but in some of those shifts are really away from external things into the internal self. So there is a move away from kind of social order, away from how you display yourself externally, to looking at identity in the self in terms of who I am internally. And so there is a shift away from things like external rules or external appearances or just general societal rules about how it is that I function in society towards me and my inner authentic self. And that leads to the second point of where we have moved as a society, which leads us kind of away from standard rules of etiquette. And that is toward a view of the self that it prizes authenticity above all things. Now, I've made other videos on this. I'm a critic of this prizing of authenticity. I think it's led to a lot of chaos and crises in our age, this notion that we have to just be authentic, or even the idea that there is some kind of authentic inner self that's divorced from our bodily or external or societal existence and relationships. I think that's a highly mistaken notion of what selfhood is. But we have this idea that you need to be authentic, and where you truly find happiness is in your authentic self. And so if you are just going by the standard rules of society and what society says is good and right, you're not really being authentic. You're not really being your true self. As Heidegger would say, you're living as the they. You're doing what they expect you to do, what society expects you to do. And so to be authentic then means often to overthrow or take off the shackles of what societal expectations and rules and regulations might be. So we see this showing up in several movements throughout the 20th century, especially in the 1960s. It's not like this begins in the 1960s, but the hippie movement was very much a real display of this idea on a large scale, to say that we want to overthrow societal expectations. We want to do our own thing and be our own authentic people, and that's where we're going to truly find happiness. And so this leads then to a third thing that has led to this move away from understanding of etiquette or value in etiquette, and that is the privileging of freedom. Now, I think we have to talk about how we're defining freedom, because here we're talking about freedom in a particular way, and I would argue that this is not a classical view of freedom, but we're talking about freedom in the sense of my personal decision, my personal value is found, or enjoyment or delight or happiness. Maybe happiness is the best way to put it. My happiness is found in my freedom to be able to make decisions according to my own preferences. And so, rules or regulations or whatever kind of limits you put on a human person are seen in this view as limitations on happiness. So true happiness comes from the freedom to be able to make my own decisions. And this is a very American idea. It comes out of the Enlightenment. And if you look at a figure like someone like a Thomas Paine, this is an idea that's been brewing for quite a long time, but I think it starts to kind of flourish in the 20th century. I think the fruits of these ideas that have been there for quite a long time start to show up at that time, and we're dealing with the consequences of that today. So there is kind of an assumption, certainly in an American context, not as much in some European contexts or in other nations and cultures. And any European will comment about this if they come over to the United States and go to a grocery store for the first time, so, where they see this. That essentially there's an assumption that if you maximize your options, you maximize freedom, because now you have more choices. And if you maximize freedom, you therefore maximize happiness. So, you go to the grocery store in many nations and you've got one brand of peanut butters, let's say, and you go to a grocery store in the United States and you've got like 20 different options, and the grocery stores are absolutely enormous. And the idea is, well, you have more happiness because you have more options. You get to pick the peanut butter that you really like. Now, even just psychologically, there have been several studies on this that demonstrate that it actually causes a lot more stress and anxiety to have to make so many decisions all the time. And it's a lot easier for us if we just have the one brand of peanut butter and don't have to think about it and just run through the grocery store, grab the peanut butter, and move on with our lives. So this, I think, applies to social rules as well. As humans, we do well when we have limits. And I would go back, as a theologian, I would go back to the Garden of Eden and say, this is kind of why God put this tree in the garden in the first place, where there is this tree of the knowledge of good and evil, where people are told not to, Adam and Eve are told not to partake of this tree. Well, people ask all sorts of questions. Well, that doesn't seem fair. Why would that be the case? Why would God put the tree there in the first place? And the point is, God is putting limits on them because creatures live within limits. We are not unlimited beings. We are not gods. And you even see this idea displayed in some of the, classical Greek myths, like the myths of Icarus. You have this story where he makes these wax wings, and Icarus flies too close to the sun because he doesn't understand his limits. He thinks that he can, because he's created these wings, he has this freedom now. He thinks he can do whatever he wants. But when he tries to transcend those limits and go without those limits, his wings melt and he crashes and dies. So the story there is getting at this truth underneath us that people should recognize, that is, we live within limits, and we do well within limits. We do well with rules. We do well with particular roles that we are assigned. And in our context today in the Western world, that's very difficult because we are trained to think in a very different way. So with all of that being said, that is the underlying concern then when I'm talking about etiquette. Because if we're talking about etiquette, this is not just something that, say, developed in Western Europe or in the United States 200 years ago, or showed up in the Victorian era, when you do have all these very, very particular rules about etiquette. But etiquette is something that has existed in all cultures and all times. There are things that tie cultures and peoples together. And some of that is rules about how it is that you behave, what is proper behavior and what is improper behavior. And we certainly could think about that in terms of morality. But when we're talking about etiquette, it's not really morality that we're speaking about. We're instead talking about social custom, what is proper, what is right, how you go about engaging in conversation with other people, how it is that you dress, how it is that you dress for certain occasions and behave in certain occasions. And so you can look at cultures all over the world, and while they may not use language of etiquette, we have social rules that people just understand. And it helps people to understand how it is that we function in society, because we do well with rules. We do well when we actually know what we're doing, instead of just facing this aimless world with our inner authentic selves, trying to make sense of things and figure out how we function in the world. It doesn't work very well. And it certainly has not led to an increase in happiness. That seems very obvious, especially when we look at statistical studies of happiness in men in particular, which is kind of another issue, but very related to this. So etiquette, if you start to understand etiquette, it gives you just some guidelines of how it is that you are to live. Like, how are you? What are the kinds of behaviors that you should be doing in particular situations? What's the right way to behave in different situations? And honestly, it takes away a lot of the anxiety about what you do in various situations, because there are actual rules and guidelines. And so you don't have to try to just kind of figure it out yourself and try not to be really awkward about what you're supposed to be doing. And one other thing about etiquette, I think if you start to read, and I have a number of etiquette manuals, okay? So, and I have some from the Victorian age, and I have more 20th century ones. There aren't as many that exist today, and the ones that do exist today aren't as good. Well, some of them are okay. I guess it just kind of depends. But Emily Post's Etiquette is kind of the classic of the 20th century, and it's been revised. I would recommend the older edition if you do want to read some. I like the Gentle Manners series for men. I think those are really helpful, because they talk about also how to raise children and how to teach them these things as well, and how to function properly in society. So one of the things that I found when you start reading a lot of these manuals on etiquette, or the texts on etiquette, so generally it's kind of and I think this is a false perception, but it's the perception that etiquette is about showing yourself to be of a better class. Now, to be clear, there have been instances of aristocracy, say in France prior to the French Revolution, where you have these very particular rules of social life that the aristocracy creates in order to cut off others from understanding what they're doing. Like, so that they can have this kind of secret code for those who are in a particular class that cuts off the common people. So it's true that happens, and it has happened at times in history. And you do see this to some extent within the Victorian era in England. You don't see it so much in the United States, but because these things are just widely accessible in the United States. And that doesn't mean social behaviors are exactly the same between classes, and etiquette is going to differ between classes and cultures, and it doesn't need to be exactly the same, because we're not talking about some objective standard, okay? So etiquette is not something there is this kind of objective universal standard that has dropped from heaven that we all have to follow the rules of this era and age. The point is, it's a structure that can and does change, and there are rituals that can and do change. But even when you look at that, I mean, if you look at sociologists talking about this, there's some general principles that do underlie even those various structures. As you look at, the structuralists like Saussure and Strauss probably in particular, as he's looking at various cultures, he sees that there are some underlying things that are more than just particularly societal constructs. There are kind of true things underneath that, or underneath those structures of behaviors that are expected in various cultures. So I don't want to say it's purely subjective, but generally how it works itself out can change. Certain things are seen as good in some societies that aren't then later, that don't have any inherent moral worth or anything like that. It's just that people and standards change, or the kind of clothing that's like considered formal 50 years later may be considered, or clothing that's maybe more the opposite. It's more clothing that's considered casual in 50 years is now considered to be quite formal, which leads to another issue of how the casualization of the world, which is very related to this actually as well. But But as you read through the majority of writing on manners, and you can go back to something like Erasmus at the time of the Reformation, so going back 500 years, where he has a manual on how boys and men should behave. The guides and rules about etiquette are not about the self at all. And something that you see over and over again is that kind of the whole point of proper etiquette in how you behave and how you talk in conversations is to actually get you outside of yourself and start looking and caring for other people. Because here's the problem. As St. Augustine said, we are born incurvatus se, curved in on ourselves. And Martin Luther repeated this at numerous points, and it's right. We are selfish creatures by nature. We are born caring for our own needs and desires. And this is the problem with being an authentic self, because the authentic self is selfish. And if we're not concerned about societal constraints on who we are, we tend to use our freedom to feed our passions, to just do the things that make us feel good. So when you're looking at something like etiquette, what it does is it's there to restrain. It's there to civilize you, to help force you to cultivate good behavior, force you to cultivate virtue. Because if you're authentic, you just do whatever you feel like you want to do in your heart. But if you start to look at rules surrounding etiquette and conversations, you start to recognize that actually these are rules that help you to look at what other people need. So rules about etiquette often have to do with things like how much you talk about yourself, when you should be quiet, when you should listen to somebody else, the kinds of questions that you should ask another person that aren't going to be rude, the kinds of questions you ask another person that are going to actually lead to you caring for them. And here's a general rule about etiquette, is that when you're talking about etiquette, you're looking at yourself and how you behave toward others. You are not using it as a way for you to judge the people around you. So it makes you a better citizen. It makes you a better neighbor. It makes you a better friend. And people recognize this. And I mean, sure, right? If you go to a dinner party and you show up and you start telling them that they put their forks in the wrong place, you're going to come off just as a jerk, right? And proper etiquette says that you don't do that, because you're just concerned about what you do, not what other people are doing. But aside from trying to do that, which hopefully you don't do, when you are displaying the proper rules of etiquette and manners, other people are going to notice. And they're going to notice in a very positive way, because they're going to think, oh, that person was very respectful toward me. Oh, that person really seemed like they cared about me. That person offered to help when they were, at the party here, or, they stood up when I came to greet them and saw them sitting down at a restaurant. They showed respect to me in that way. They didn't, shove food in their mouth before everybody else did, looking and acting selfish. They showed that they actually cared about the group of people that were around them. So the loss of etiquette is part of a broader cultural problem, which is that we are losing the external things and looking for inner authenticity in the self. But really, the external things are good for us. They give us a sense of what we are to do. They take away our anxieties about what we're to do in various situations, because they just give us standards and rules. They help us to actually look for the good of others in social situations instead of just being selfish. And they help us to see that who we are as people is not just these isolated, free wills that can just go make free choices to try to find happiness somewhere. We're people who live in a society, in a culture that we've been given. We've inherited tradition. We've inherited things about the place that we're in. We've inherited, families that we're a part of, that we didn't choose. And all of that is actually good. And so we can recognize that and then live within the boundaries that God has given us in the place where we are in our life and in our society. Well, hopefully this was some helpful food for thought, just some things that I think about, that I've mentioned on different videos that I've done, but I never spent time just talking about it. So let me know if you want me to do more things like this, or I've talked about before actually just going through some standards or rules of etiquette. That wouldn't be a normal podcast topic, because it's a little off the topic from what I usually do for my long podcast, but I'm happy to do separate side videos on these kind of things. And it's something that I enjoy, and I do think it's important in terms of our addressing the issues that we're facing in the world today, because I do focus largely on the issues we're facing in the church. And that's my primary calling as a theologian and a ordained pastor and the president of a theological seminary. But I also am concerned with the broader world, because God rules the right-hand kingdom, which is the church, and he rules the left-hand kingdom, which is broader culture and society. So that I do think there are plenty of things that we can say about broader society as well. So I'm concerned about that. I don't think the church should just be, this isolated sphere, and we should just ignore what's going on in the world, because these external things do affect all of us. And I do think also, as Christians, we have a place to speak to the broader world and the issues that we are facing. So thanks so much for watching. Make sure you subscribe here on YouTube, and we'll see you in the next one. God bless.